6 years into my marriage, my wife sat across from me at our kitchen table with a folder of documents that could end everything we had built together, and she asked me a question I had been dreading since the day we met. My wife spent 3 weeks making sure I could never touch her money. She spent 0 minutes wondering how much of mine there was to touch. That single fact sat quietly at the center of our marriage for 6 years, and neither of us said a word about it out loud. I let her believe what she wanted to believe, because the version of me she thought she married was easier to live with than the one who actually existed. What she was protecting was $10 million. What she never asked about was $400 million. By the end of this story, you will understand exactly why I let that silence stand for as long as it did, and what it finally cost both of us the day it broke. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Nathan Cole, and for most of my adult life, I have been very good at being underestimated. I grew up outside Dayton, Ohio, in a house where money was something you argued about at the kitchen table, never something you had enough of to stop arguing. My father worked in a parts warehouse for 30 years, coming home smelling of machine oil and cardboard, too tired most nights to do more than eat and sleep. My mother cleaned offices after dark, leaving before we woke and returning after we were already at school, so that some weeks I saw her only on Sundays. I watched both of them grow old faster than they should have, worn down by a version of America that promised effort would be rewarded, and mostly just took the effort and kept it for itself. I decided early, maybe around 14, that I would build something that owed nothing to luck, nothing to inheritance, nothing to anyone's permission. I got a scholarship to a state school for computer science, worked 2 jobs through all 4 years, and graduated with almost no debt and an idea I had been sketching on napkins since sophomore year. I didn't tell my parents how serious I was about it, because I had learned by then that big plans announced too early tend to get talked out of you by people who love you and are simply afraid of watching you fail. I kept the plan to myself and built it in the evenings, after a day job that paid the rent and nothing more. My first real company came together when I was 26, a piece of logistics software that solved a boring, unglamorous problem for regional trucking fleets, helping dispatchers route drivers more efficiently and cut fuel costs by a margin that sounds small until you multiply it across 1,000 trucks a day. Nobody wants to hear about freight routing at a dinner party, and that suited me fine, because a business nobody finds interesting is a business nobody bothers to look at closely. I ran that company for 11 years, growing it slowly, reinvesting almost everything, living on a fraction of what it generated, even as the numbers climbed into territory I had never expected to see in my lifetime. I sold that first company at 37, and I sold it quietly, through a holding structure my attorney built specifically to keep my name off anything a reporter, a business rival, or a curious future partner could easily find with a simple search. I want to be honest about why I did that, because I think people hear about structures like that and assume the person behind them is hiding something shameful. I wasn't hiding shame, I was hiding a number, and I had very specific reasons for wanting that number invisible. Reasons that went back to a woman named Patricia and a relationship I rarely talk about, even now. I met Patricia when my first company was still small, back when the money in my accounts was modest by comparison to what it would eventually become, but visible enough that people around me had started to notice the pattern of steady, quiet success. She was smart and funny and seemed genuinely interested in me during the early months, and I let myself believe, the way you do at 29 when you've spent your 20s working instead of dating, that I had finally found someone who saw the whole person rather than the bank balance attached to him. It took me almost a year to understand that she had been quietly tracking every signal of my finances the entire time, asking careful, seemingly casual questions, designed to estimate a number I had never directly told her. I found out the truth by accident, the way these things usually surface, when a mutual friend mentioned offhand that Patricia had told her, months earlier, roughly what she expected my company to be worth if I ever sold it. The number she had guessed was almost exactly right, which meant she had been doing quiet arithmetic in the background of a relationship I had believed was built on something else entirely. I ended things within a week, and I spent a long time afterward turning the experience over in my mind, trying to understand what I had missed, what signal I had ignored, and how I could build a life where that particular kind of miscalculation never happened to me again. The answer I settled on was simple, and in hindsight, probably too extreme. I decided that no one would ever know the true size of what I had built unless I chose, very deliberately, to tell them. I built a second company 5 years after selling the first, this time in industrial data infrastructure, another unglamorous, profitable niche that nobody outside the industry cared to examine closely. I sold that one too, 5 years later, for a number even larger than the first, and by the time I turned 46, my net worth had crossed $400 million. Almost no one alive knew that number. Not my parents, who had passed by then believing I did reasonably well for myself. Not my siblings. Not a single person outside 2 attorneys and an accountant I trusted completely. I lived, on paper and in practice, like a man doing comfortably well and nothing more. I drove a pickup truck that was 11 years old, the same one I had bought used back when my first company was still finding its footing. I lived in a 4-bedroom house on a quiet street, in a neighborhood full of dentists and mid-level executives, the kind of place no one goes looking for 9 figures, because nothing about it suggests they'd find them. I wore the same 3 or 4 jackets to every event that required one. I told people, when asked, that I did consulting work in logistics and data systems, which was technically true and revealed almost nothing. Every part of that life was constructed on purpose, brick by careful brick, specifically so that no one would ever again do the kind of quiet arithmetic Patricia had done. I met Claire Bennett at a charity gala in downtown Columbus, one of those events I usually attended out of obligation, standing near the back wall with a drink I rarely finished, waiting for a socially acceptable moment to slip out early. Claire was there representing her own company, a boutique real estate development firm she had built from nothing over 12 years, buying distressed properties, renovating them carefully, and selling or leasing them at a profit that had, deal by deal, made her genuinely wealthy in her own right. I noticed her before we spoke, mostly because she was the only person in the room who seemed to be having an actual conversation rather than performing one, laughing at something with her whole face rather than the careful half-smile most people wear at those functions. We ended up talking for over an hour that first night, drifting from the gala's actual purpose into something closer to a real conversation, the kind you don't expect to have with a stranger at an event like that. She told me about her first deal, a rundown duplex she had bought with almost her entire savings at 26, terrified the whole time that she had made a catastrophic mistake, only to sell it 18 months later for enough profit to fund her second project. She talked about her business with a plain, steady pride that had nothing performative in it, no interest in impressing me, just genuine satisfaction in work she had built entirely with her own hands and her own risk tolerance. I found out later, through a passing comment from a mutual acquaintance, that Claire's company was worth roughly $10 million by then, every bit of it earned rather than inherited, and that she was fiercely, almost defensively proud of that fact. I understood that pride instinctively, because it mirrored something in my own story, except my number had simply grown 40 times larger, and I had spent years making sure no one could see it. I remember thinking, driving home that night, that Claire was the first person in a long time who had asked me real questions about my life without once steering the conversation toward numbers, and I wanted, very badly, to keep that feeling exactly as it was. I gave her the truncated version of my story that night, and for a long while afterward, the version I had rehearsed specifically for moments like this one. Software, sold a company, doing consulting work now, nothing more specific than that. She nodded, asked what doing fine looked like in practice, day to day, and seemed genuinely satisfied with an answer built around modest consulting income and an unremarkable house. She never pushed further, not that night, and not for a long time afterward, and I told myself that her lack of curiosity was proof of good character rather than what it actually was, which was simply the absence of any reason to suspect there was more beneath the surface than what I had shown her. We dated for close to a year and a half before I proposed, and across that entire stretch of time, Claire never once asked to see a bank statement, never pressed on the vague edges of the story I had given her, never asked what my consulting income actually amounted to in concrete numbers. Looking back now, I understand that this wasn't naivety on her part. She wasn't performing indifference to money while secretly keeping score the way Patricia had. She genuinely didn't care about my specific number because she had built her own $10 million through years of risk and sacrifice, and she measured her own worth against that figure, not against whatever I might or might not be quietly holding. I told myself, during those months, that her disinterest was proof she loved me, for reasons that had nothing to do with money, and I still believe, even now, that this was largely true. What I didn't yet understand was that her genuine lack of curiosity was also the exact condition that allowed my secret to survive as long as it eventually did. A more suspicious partner might have pressed harder, asked more direct questions, noticed inconsistencies sooner. Claire's honesty about her own finances made her assume a similar honesty in mine, and I let that assumption stand, quietly, for years longer than I should have. There were moments during that year and a half, quieter moments most people would never notice from the outside, where I came closer than I ever admitted to telling her the truth. I remember one night, early on, maybe 4 months into dating, when Claire told me about a property deal that had nearly bankrupted her in her 3rd year of business, a warehouse conversion that went badly over budget and left her carrying debt she didn't fully clear for almost 2 years afterward. She told the story with a kind of hard-won humor, the way people do once they've survived something and come out the other side stronger for it. And I remember sitting there thinking that I owed her a comparable piece of honesty, some real accounting of my own risk and my own numbers. I told her a smaller story instead, about a client who nearly didn't pay an invoice on time. Technically true, entirely beside the point. I think what kept me from telling her, more than any calculated strategy, was simply the accumulating weight of every previous omission. Each month that passed without correction made the next correction harder to imagine, because it was no longer just a matter of revealing a number. It had become a matter of explaining why I had let an entire year go by without mentioning it. Claire, for her part, filled the space I left with her own version of me, a comfortable, private, unshowy man who had built something solid but modest, and I watched her fall in love with that version without ever quite finding the courage to replace it with the real one. We got engaged on a weekend trip to the coast of Maine, a place neither of us had been before, chosen deliberately because it had no history attached to either of us, no old memories to compete with the new one we were making. Claire cried when I asked her, which surprised me a little, because she wasn't a person who cried easily or often, and I remember thinking, in that moment, standing on cold sand with the ring already on her hand, that I had never wanted anything as much as I wanted this particular future to work out cleanly. It didn't occur to me then how much weight a single unspoken number could eventually carry. About 4 months before the wedding, Claire came to me with something she had clearly rehearsed carefully in advance. She wanted a prenuptial agreement, and she wanted to be the one who brought it up first, so there would never be any question later about whose idea it had been. She explained, in the careful, deliberate tone of someone who had thought about this for a long time before saying it out loud, that she had built her $10 million entirely alone, through years of financial risk, long nights reviewing contractor bids, and mistakes she had paid for personally out of her own reserves, and she was not going to enter a marriage where any part of that history could be touched, questioned, or divided if things ever went wrong between us. She said all of this with a kind of quiet steel that I found genuinely admirable, even as I sat there listening and knowing exactly how disproportionate her fear actually was compared to the truth. I told her I understood completely, and I meant every word of it, because I did understand the impulse to protect something you built with your own hands from people who might later try to claim a share of it they never earned. I just didn't tell her the part where the protection she was so carefully constructing was aimed entirely at the wrong number, built to guard against a threat that, given who I actually was, could never realistically materialize in the way she feared. Claire hired an attorney named Sylvia Okafor, a sharp, meticulous woman with a reputation for handling prenuptial agreements for entrepreneurs and executives across the state. The kind of attorney who reads every clause 3 times and assumes the worst-case scenario as a professional habit rather than a personal insult. Sylvia's entire job, as she explained it to both of us in that first meeting, was to protect Claire's $10 million from every conceivable angle, covering appreciation on the business, future earnings, ownership structure, anything that could someday become a point of contention in a courtroom neither of us wanted to imagine standing in. I hired an attorney of my own, an old friend named Marcus Whitfield, who had known me since business school, back before either of us had built anything worth protecting. Marcus was the only person outside my accountants who understood the true scope of what I owned, and he had watched, over the years, as I built and sold 2 companies while maintaining a public life that revealed almost nothing about the private one. He sat across from me in his office 3 weeks before the wedding, closed the door in a way he rarely did, and asked me directly whether I intended to disclose my actual net worth to Claire before either of us signed anything binding. I told him no, and I remember the specific silence that followed, longer than his silences usually were. Marcus didn't yell, because Marcus never yells, but he leaned back in his chair and studied me for a long moment before he spoke again, choosing his words with obvious care. He told me that whatever fear I was still carrying from Patricia, whatever wound I was still protecting myself from all these years later, silence was going to cost me far more in the end than transparency ever could, and that a marriage built on a hidden number wasn't the same thing as a marriage built on trust, no matter how steady and genuine it felt from the inside, while the secret was still holding. I told him I understood the risk completely, and that I wanted to see one specific thing play out before I made any final decision about disclosure. I wanted to know, with real certainty, whether Claire would have chosen to marry me at all if she had known the true number from the very beginning of our relationship. And I believed, rightly or wrongly, that the only way to answer that question honestly was to let the smaller, false number stand a little while longer and watch what she built her life around in the meantime. Marcus told me that was a dangerous kind of experiment to run on someone you claimed to love, and looking back now, I think he was right in ways I wasn't ready to hear at the time. The negotiations over the prenup stretched across 3 full weeks, and Claire treated every single session like a serious business deal, because in her mind, that is exactly what it was. She reviewed every draft personally before signing off on language, questioning clauses she thought were ambiguous, pushing back hard whenever Sylvia suggested wording she felt was too soft or too easily challenged later. She wasn't cold about any of it, and she wasn't cruel. She was simply thorough in the specific way she had trained herself to be thorough about anything that mattered to her financially, a habit built over 12 years of reviewing contracts on distressed properties, where a single overlooked clause could cost her tens of thousands of dollars. I sat across from her during those long sessions, watching a woman fight fiercely and methodically to protect $10 million from a man who could have quietly paid off every outstanding mortgage in her hometown without noticing the withdrawal on any statement, and I said absolutely nothing about the gap between what she believed she was protecting herself from and what actually existed on the other side of the table. Saying something, even then, even as late as those final weeks, would have ended the experiment before I had the answer I had convinced myself I needed. So I let her keep fighting a battle against a threat that was, in real terms, almost comically smaller than the truth. There was one particular evening during that stretch of negotiation that I still think about often. Claire came home late from a session with Sylvia, exhausted in the way she only got after a long day of contract work, and she sat down across from me at the table and asked, almost quietly, whether I thought she was being excessive. She said some part of her worried that fighting this hard over $10 million made her look distrustful, or worse, made her look like the kind of person who cared more about money than about the marriage itself. I told her she wasn't being excessive at all, that protecting what you built alone was never something to apologize for, and I meant it completely. What I didn't say was that the number she was protecting was so far below the actual stakes of our marriage that her worry, however genuine, was aimed at a target that barely existed. The final signing took place on a Tuesday afternoon in Sylvia's downtown office, both attorneys present, both copies notarized, and carefully tabbed at every signature line. The whole process handled with the brisk efficiency of people who had done this dozens of times before. Claire signed first, and I remember her handwriting was steady and deliberate in a way it always was when something mattered deeply to her. No rush, no hesitation. Every letter formed with the same careful attention she gave to every contract in her own business. I signed second, and I did it without reading a single clause of a document I had already memorized weeks earlier, because I already knew every word in that agreement was built around a number that wasn't remotely close to being true. Sylvia thanked us both afterward for handling the process so reasonably, remarking that she wished more couples approached these conversations with the same maturity we had shown across 3 weeks of negotiation. Marcus, sitting beside me through all of it, said nothing at all in that moment, though I could feel the weight of everything he had already told me privately, sitting between us in that room. He didn't need to repeat it. He had already made his position clear weeks earlier, and now all either of us could do was watch what happened next, knowing the clock on my private experiment had officially started running the moment both signatures dried on the page. The wedding itself took place 6 weeks later, a modest ceremony by design, at a small venue outside Columbus that Claire had chosen because it reminded her of a property she had once restored early in her career. I remember standing at the front of that room, watching her walk toward me, and feeling, for one uncomfortable moment, the full weight of what I was choosing not to tell her, even as I prepared to promise her everything else. I pushed the feeling down the way I had learned to push down most uncomfortable truths over the years, and by the time she reached me, I had convinced myself again that this was simply the price of protecting something I had built alone, long before I ever knew her. Life after the wedding settled into something that looked, from the outside, completely ordinary in every way that mattered. Claire continued running her development company with the same discipline she had always shown, closing deals steadily, managing contractors with an eye for detail that bordered on obsessive, growing her $10 million a little larger with each passing year through smart, patient decisions. I kept my 11-year-old truck, kept the modest house in the neighborhood full of dentists, kept my vague consulting story fully intact whenever anyone asked, and quietly managed a portfolio behind the scenes that generated more in a single ordinary afternoon than her entire company was worth on paper. We split grocery bills the way any two working professionals might, argued occasionally about small, forgettable things, a contractor she didn't fully trust, a vacation destination I privately thought was overpriced for what it offered. The ordinary friction that comes from two people building a shared life together out of two previously separate ones. Underneath all of that ordinary texture sat a number Claire had no idea existed, growing steadily larger every single year, completely invisible inside a structure built specifically to stay that way. I want to be honest and say that most days I didn't think about the gap at all. It had simply become the architecture of my life, familiar enough to stop feeling like a secret and start feeling, dangerously, like just another quiet fact about myself. Claire's younger sister Diane never fully warmed to me, not in the way the rest of her family eventually did, and I think, looking back now, with the clarity that only comes after everything unraveled, some instinct in her had picked up on something the rest of the family simply missed entirely. Diane would ask pointed, casual-sounding questions at family dinners, small things individually, but persistent over time, wondering aloud why I never mentioned old clients by name, why my supposed consulting income never seemed to track cleanly with any visible client list she could ask around about, why a man who described himself as doing fine for himself never once flinched at a repair estimate or a restaurant bill the way people who are genuinely just fine tend to flinch without thinking about it. Claire always defended me during those dinners, telling her sister, sometimes with visible irritation, that not everyone needed to broadcast the details of their finances to family gatherings, that some people were simply private by nature, and that privacy wasn't the same thing as deception. I let her defend me every single time, because it was far easier to sit quietly and let her handle her sister's suspicion than to confront directly what Diane was actually circling, week after week, dinner after dinner, without ever quite landing on the specific truth she was reaching for. I told myself Diane was simply being difficult, the way some siblings are, and I didn't let myself consider, not seriously, what it meant that someone outside the marriage was noticing gaps that Claire herself had never thought to look for. One Thanksgiving, about a year and a half into the marriage, Diane pushed harder than usual, asking directly, in front of the whole family, what exactly my old company had done and why she could never find any trace of it online. I gave a practiced, vague answer about it being sold to a larger firm and folded into a division that no longer used the original name. Technically true, deliberately unhelpful. Claire jumped in immediately, telling her sister to let it go, and the table moved on to other conversation within minutes. I remember catching Diane's eye briefly across the table afterward, and something in her expression told me she hadn't actually let it go at all. She had simply decided the dinner table wasn't the place to keep pushing. The first real crack in the entire structure appeared about 2 years into the marriage, during a period when one of my older investment vehicles required an emergency capital injection to avoid triggering a significant contractual penalty tied to a deal I had made years before Claire and I had even met. Marcus handled the wire transfer directly on my behalf, moving an amount of money that would have taken Claire's entire company roughly 3 good years of steady profit to generate, and he moved it through an account structure Claire had absolutely no visibility into and no reason to ever suspect existed. For about 4 seconds one Tuesday evening, standing in our kitchen, I genuinely believed the entire architecture I had spent years building was about to collapse in front of me, without warning. A banking notification briefly appeared on a shared tablet we kept on the kitchen counter, the kind of alert that flashes across a lock screen for a few seconds before disappearing. And Claire happened to glance at it just as it faded. She asked, casually, what the alert had been about, and I told her it was an old business matter, finally closing out after years of paperwork, technically true in the loosest possible sense, and she accepted that answer the same way she had accepted every vague answer I had given her before it, without suspicion, without follow-up questions, simply moving on to whatever came next in our evening. I deleted the notification from the tablet's history later that night, hands steadier than I expected them to be, and told myself the close call was over. Marcus grew noticeably more insistent after that particular incident, calling me more often than usual, always with the same underlying message delivered in slightly different words each time. He told me plainly that the wire transfer scare wasn't a close call I should feel any relief about surviving. It was a direct warning about how genuinely thin the margin actually was between my careful architecture holding and it collapsing entirely without warning, and that every additional year the secret continued was simply another year of interest accumulating on a debt of honesty I would eventually have to pay in full, likely at a moment I couldn't control or prepare for the way I had controlled everything else in my life. He told me, more directly than he ever had before, that if I continued refusing to tell Claire the truth myself, there would eventually come a point where he could no longer sit across from her at family holidays, exchanging pleasant conversation, fully aware of what he knew while she remained completely in the dark. I told him each time that I needed more time to figure out the right moment, the right way to frame it, the right context that would make 6 years of silence feel explainable rather than simply like a prolonged betrayal. What I didn't tell him, because I could barely admit it to myself, was that some quiet part of me had started to find a strange comfort in maintaining 2 entirely separate financial identities, one visible and modest, one enormous and completely hidden from view. Looking back, I think that period, the 2 years or so after the wire transfer scare, was when I came closest to actually telling her. There were at least 3 separate evenings I remember clearly, quiet nights after dinner, when Claire was relaxed and the conversation had drifted somewhere honest and unguarded, when I felt the truth sitting right at the edge of my mouth, ready to come out if I simply let it. Each time, I found a reason to swallow it back down, telling myself the timing wasn't quite right, that she seemed stressed about a deal at work, that raising it now would feel like it was about something else entirely, rather than simply being the truth I owed her. Each excuse felt reasonable in the moment. Looking back, they were simply the same fear, wearing different clothes. The unraveling, when it finally began in earnest, started the way these things usually do in real life, not with a dramatic discovery or a confrontation staged like something out of a courtroom drama, but with a small, almost forgettable inconsistency that Claire noticed nearly by accident while doing routine paperwork that had nothing to do with me at all. She was reviewing old tax documents connected to an unrelated refinancing application on one of her development properties, cross-referencing filing dates with her accountant late one evening at the kitchen table, when she came across a filing reference tied to an entity she didn't immediately recognize, one connected loosely, through a chain of paperwork she hadn't been looking for, to my name. She mentioned it to me casually at first, almost offhandedly, the way you'd mention noticing a typo in a document you were only skimming, clearly assuming there was some simple, boring explanation behind it. I gave her one, thin and hurried, something about an old consulting arrangement structured through a holding entity for tax purposes, and she let the matter go for close to 6 weeks afterward, apparently satisfied enough not to think about it further. But Claire had spent 12 years building a $10 million company by training herself to notice exactly the kinds of small inconsistencies most people let go without a second thought. And something about that particular filing name stayed lodged in the back of her memory in a way I didn't fully appreciate or understand until it was far too late to manage. She began asking questions quietly over the following weeks, in the careful, patient way that careful people tend to operate, rather than confronting a suspicion head-on the moment it first takes root. She pulled public records on the entity name during a slow afternoon at her office, following the paper trail layer by layer through a chain of holding companies that traced back, eventually, to structures Marcus had built for me years earlier, long before Claire and I had even met. She didn't say a single word to me about any of this while it was actively happening. Instead, she grew noticeably quieter over those weeks, more observant than usual, watching closely how I handled certain phone calls, noticing which conversations I quietly took into another room rather than finishing at the kitchen table where she could overhear them. She noticed, too, that my supposed consulting income, at least on the surface figures I had always given her, never seemed to reasonably match a lifestyle that occasionally included travel arrangements I described only vaguely as work trips, arrangements that were, in reality, considerably more comfortable than any modest consulting income could realistically explain. Claire had spent her entire professional career reading financial documents closely for a living, learning to see through vague language and convenient omissions in contracts far more complicated than anything I had given her, and eventually, piece by piece, the documents themselves told her far more than I had ever willingly told her directly across 6 years of marriage. I noticed the change in her too, though I misread almost every signal at the time, chalking her growing quietness up to stress at work or a difficult client, rather than anything closer to home. She started asking me small, seemingly unrelated questions during dinner, questions about old business partners I hadn't mentioned in years, about a trip I had taken before we met, about a name she had apparently come across somewhere that I had never once brought up myself. I answered each one carefully, believing I was simply satisfying idle curiosity, not realizing she was quietly assembling a picture piece by piece, testing my answers against records she had already reviewed without telling me. Diane called Claire directly during this period too, something I only learned about much later, telling her sister plainly that she had never trusted the vague shape of my financial history and encouraging her to look closer rather than accept the comfortable version of events she had lived with for years. Claire told me afterward that this call hadn't been the reason she kept digging. She had already started the process on her own weeks earlier, but hearing her sister voice the same suspicion out loud made her feel less alone in pursuing it, and less foolish for taking the inconsistency seriously in the first place. The confrontation, when it finally arrived, happened on an ordinary Thursday evening in early autumn, with no dramatic build-up beforehand, no warning signs I had noticed that day, beyond a quietness in Claire that I mistook, foolishly, for simple tiredness after a long week of closings. She was sitting at our kitchen table when I came home, a folder of printed filings and records spread out neatly in front of her, organized the same careful way she organized every contract review in her own business. She didn't yell when I walked in, and she didn't cry either, not at first. She asked me one direct question, calm and steady, in a way that frightened me more than shouting would have, wanting to know exactly how much I was actually worth, making it clear she already had enough documentation in front of her to know that whatever I said next needed to be the complete truth, because she no longer required my cooperation to eventually find out anyway. I sat down across from her at that table, in the same kitchen where an alert had nearly ended everything years earlier, and I told her the real number for the first time in 6 years of marriage. $400 million, built quietly across 2 companies she had only ever heard about in the vague, carefully sanded-down version I had given her back when we were still dating, a version designed specifically to reveal nothing while technically remaining true. I watched her face while I said it, bracing myself for the reaction I had spent years quietly rehearsing scenarios for in my own mind, certain it would involve immediate anger, tears, and swift talk of ending the marriage entirely before the evening was over. Her actual reaction wasn't what I had spent years preparing myself for. She sat very still for a long stretch of time afterward, processing something that clearly went beyond simple anger or straightforward betrayal, something closer to a kind of quiet, disorienting humiliation. She told me that the prenup she had fought so hard to negotiate over 3 exhausting weeks, the single document she had treated as the most important financial decision of her entire adult life, had been built entirely around protecting $10 million from a man who could have absorbed that entire figure as a rounding error on a single month's investment returns without noticing the loss at all. The irony of it, she said quietly, wasn't just painful to sit with, it was humiliating in a way she hadn't remotely prepared herself for, because she realized in that moment that she had spent 3 intense weeks defending herself against a threat that bore almost no resemblance to the one that actually existed the entire time. She asked me question after question that night, working through the timeline methodically, the same way she worked through a difficult contract, wanting to know exactly when each piece of the story had happened, when I had sold each company, when Marcus had known, whether Sylvia had ever suspected anything during the negotiations. I answered every question honestly for the first time in years, and I remember thinking, strangely, that the relief of finally telling the complete truth felt almost as significant as the fear I had carried about telling it in the first place. Claire didn't say much in response to most of my answers. She simply listened, filing each piece of information away with the same careful attention she gave to everything else in her life. What followed in the weeks and months after that Thursday evening wasn't a clean, tidy resolution, because real betrayals of this size rarely produce anything close to a clean resolution. Claire needed considerable time, more time than either of us initially expected, to decide whether the marriage could genuinely survive, knowing that her husband had constructed an entire second financial life in secret, hidden carefully behind an 11-year-old truck and a deliberately modest house, chosen specifically to keep her from ever asking the kinds of questions that might have led her here sooner. She asked me, more than once during those difficult months, whether I would have ever told her the truth voluntarily if that filing hadn't surfaced by pure accident during an unrelated refinancing review, and I had to admit to her honestly that I genuinely didn't know the answer, and that the not knowing was, in its own uncomfortable way, an answer all by itself. She moved into the guest room for close to 2 months during that period, not as a formal separation, she was careful to tell me, but because she needed physical distance to think clearly, without the immediate pull of shared space clouding her judgment. We still spoke daily, still managed the ordinary logistics of a shared household, but the conversations were different, more careful, more deliberate. The easy familiarity of 6 years of marriage replaced by something closer to 2 people relearning how to be honest with each other from scratch. I didn't push her during those months. I had already taken enough choices away from her by staying silent for so long. And I understood, finally and completely, that this particular decision needed to be entirely hers. Marcus told me later, once things had settled into a new and different kind of normal, that watching Claire and me work through that difficult period had been harder for him to witness than any business negotiation he had handled across 30 years of legal practice. Because there was no contract clause anywhere, no matter how carefully drafted, that could repair what 6 years of accumulated silence actually does to the foundation of trust between two people. He said he had seen plenty of marriages survive financial disagreements over the years, but very few survived the specific discovery that an entire parallel financial identity had existed the whole time, hidden in plain sight behind ordinary routines neither party had ever thought twice about. Diane, to her credit, never once said the words she easily could have said during that period, never told Claire directly that she had suspected something along these lines for years. She simply stayed close, showing up for dinner more often, letting Claire talk when she wanted to talk, and staying quiet when she didn't. And I found myself, unexpectedly, grateful to a woman who had never once warmed to me, because she was showing her sister exactly the kind of steady support Claire needed most during those uncertain months. I had one conversation with Diane myself during that stretch, unplanned, the two of us alone in the kitchen one evening while Claire was upstairs. She didn't raise her voice, and she didn't say anything I could have argued with, because everything she said was simply true. She told me she had watched me for years, noticing the small gaps, the vague answers, the way I steered conversations away from specifics whenever money came up, and that she had chosen not to push harder because it wasn't her place to unravel her sister's marriage over a suspicion she couldn't prove. She said the hardest part for her now wasn't being right, it was watching Claire question her own judgment over something Diane felt she should have pushed harder to expose years earlier. I told her she had nothing to apologize for, and I meant it. The failure had always been mine to correct, not hers to force into the open. Claire's parents took the news harder than I expected, in a different way than Claire herself had. Her father, a retired contractor who had built his own modest success over decades of physical labor, seemed less troubled by the size of the number itself, and more troubled by the idea that his daughter had spent 3 weeks negotiating a legal document based on false premises, without either attorney in the room realizing the actual scale of what was being protected. He asked me directly, at a family dinner months later, why I hadn't simply told Claire the truth on our first serious date, and I didn't have an answer that satisfied him, because I didn't fully have one that satisfied myself either. Sylvia called me directly, about 3 weeks after the confrontation, something she had never done before during the original negotiation, and told me plainly that she felt professionally embarrassed not to have caught any sign of what she now knew during 3 full weeks of supposedly thorough due diligence. I told her honestly that there was nothing she could have found, because I had built the entire structure years earlier specifically to survive exactly the kind of scrutiny she was trained to apply. She was quiet for a moment on the phone, before telling me that she hoped, whatever happened between Claire and me going forward, I understood that the damage from something like this rarely comes from the money itself. It comes from the years spent proving you were willing to let someone operate with less information than you had. Claire and I saw a therapist together for the first time about 6 weeks into that difficult stretch, something neither of us had ever done before in 6 years of marriage, and I remember sitting in that office, feeling more exposed than I had felt even at the kitchen table the night of the confrontation. The therapist asked me a simple question early on, wanting to know what I had actually been afraid would happen if I told Claire the truth on our first date, or during our engagement, or at any point across 6 years of marriage before she found out on her own. I didn't have a clean answer. The honest answer, which took me several sessions to actually say out loud, was that I had never fully stopped being the 29-year-old who found out Patricia had been quietly doing arithmetic on his life, and some part of me had simply kept running that same defensive calculation for nearly 2 decades afterward, long past the point where it made any rational sense to keep running it with Claire. Those therapy sessions continued for the better part of a year, longer than either of us expected going in. And I remember the shift happening slowly, rather than all at once. Small moments, where Claire would ask a direct question about money at dinner, and I would answer immediately and completely, without the old reflex to soften or redirect. She told me, months into that process, that what she needed most wasn't a single grand gesture of transparency. It was the accumulation of hundreds of small, honest moments, proof built up over time, rather than a single conversation that could just as easily have been another performance. I understood what she meant, because I had spent years building an elaborate performance of modesty, and rebuilding trust required something slower and less dramatic than the secrecy had been. There was a specific afternoon, almost a year after the confrontation, that I think of as the real turning point, more than the night at the kitchen table itself. Claire asked me to come with her to a closing on a new property, something she had never invited me to before in all our years of marriage, treating her business as entirely her own domain the way she always had. She introduced me to the buyers simply as her husband, no qualifiers, no vague description of what I did for a living. And afterward, in the car, she told me she wanted me to actually understand her business the way she now understood mine, fully and specifically, rather than living parallel to each other's work the way we always had before. We are still married today, though I won't pretend for a moment that the marriage looks exactly the way it did before that particular Thursday evening changed everything between us. Claire insisted on renegotiating the prenup entirely, this time with full and complete knowledge of what she was actually protecting herself from. And this time I sat through every single session personally and read every clause myself before signing anything, rather than treating the process as something happening around me, rather than with me. She still runs her development company today, still fiercely proud of every single dollar she built, entirely without my help or influence. And I believe that particular pride has actually grown stronger since the truth came out, not weaker, because she now understands the full shape and scale of what she chose to stay for, with complete information rather than partial truth. The new agreement looks nothing like the original one Sylvia drafted all those years ago. It accounts for the actual scale of what I own, structures a level of transparency between us that simply didn't exist before, and includes provisions Claire specifically requested to ensure she would never again find herself learning something this significant about our shared life through an accidental filing discovery rather than through me directly. Sylvia handled this second negotiation too, and I remember her commenting, near the end of the process, that she had drafted hundreds of prenuptial agreements over her career, but never one quite like this, built not around protecting two people from each other, but around repairing what secrecy had already damaged. I learned something significant through all of this too, something I genuinely wish I had understood clearly before I ever met Patricia, all those years earlier, before an entire pattern of secrecy calcified into the defining habit of my adult life. Hiding the true size of what you have doesn't actually protect a relationship from risk the way I once believed it did. It simply moves that risk somewhere you can't see it clearly, tucked away out of view, until the specific day it eventually finds you anyway, usually at the moment you least expect it and are least prepared to manage the consequences on your own terms. Claire found $400 million hidden inside an ordinary marriage, and what she chose to do afterward, staying, rebuilding, insisting on complete honesty going forward, taught me more about genuine trust than any number in any account ever could. If there's one thing I'd want anyone hearing this story to take away, it's this. The number you're protecting yourself from is rarely the number that actually matters. Claire spent 3 weeks defending $10 million from a threat that didn't exist, while the real threat to our marriage was sitting quietly across the table from her the entire time, wearing an 11-year-old truck and a modest house like armor. Trust, once it's built on a foundation with something missing from it, doesn't collapse all at once. It simply waits, patiently, for the day the missing piece finally surfaces on its own.